He walked into the Manhattan Superior Court, wearing a $5,000 suit, holding the hand of a woman half his age, convinced the world was his for the taking. Preston Sterling wasn't just a billionaire. He was a shark who had never lost a fight. He thought divorcing his quiet, simple wife, Catherine, would be just another business transaction, a shedding of dead weight. But Preston forgot the golden rule of empire building: never underestimate the person holding the foundation together. In the next few minutes, you are going to witness one of the most brutal, satisfying, and shocking courtroom takedowns in history. When the judge reads the final verdict, Preston won't just lose his money. He'll realize he never actually owned it in the first place. The invitation to the Met Gala had arrived 3 months ago, but Preston Sterling hadn't bothered to RSVP until the day before. That was just who Preston was. At 46, he was the CEO of Sterling Hartwell Industries, a conglomerate that had its tentacles in everything from pharmaceutical shipping to AI-driven logistics. He moved through the world with the heavy, destructive grace of a wrecking ball painted in gold leaf. On the night of the gala, the flashbulbs on the red carpet were blinding. Preston stepped out of his black Maybach, buttoning his tuxedo jacket. He didn't turn to help his wife out of the car. He didn't have to. Catherine Sterling, 43, was already out, smoothing the front of her deep navy velvet gown. Catherine, or Kate, as only her oldest friends called her, was the picture of dignity. She wasn't the flashy trophy wife the tabloids loved. She didn't have lip fillers or a reality show presence. She was elegant, silent, and fiercely private. She walked 2 steps behind Preston, a habit she had formed over 20 years of marriage. To the outside world, she was the shadow to his light. "Smile, Catherine," Preston muttered without looking at her, waving to a photographer from Vanity Fair. "You look like you're attending a funeral." "Perhaps I am," Catherine said softly. Her voice was calm, barely audible over the screaming fans. Preston ignored her. He was too busy scanning the crowd for Tiffany. Tiffany Leclerc was 24, an influencer-turned-consultant whom Preston had hired 6 months ago to revamp the company image. She was currently standing at the top of the stairs, wearing a dress that was less fabric and more suggestion. It was a sheer diamond-encrusted mesh that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. When Preston reached the top of the stairs, he didn't just greet Tiffany. He stopped the entire procession. In front of 300 cameras and the elite of New York society, Preston Sterling took Tiffany's hand, kissed it, and pulled her to his side, effectively boxing his wife out of the frame. The murmurs started instantly. It wasn't just an affair, it was a declaration of war. Preston leaned into Catherine's ear, his voice dripping with arrogant amusement. "I think it's time, Kate. The lawyers will be at the penthouse in the morning. Try not to make a scene when you move out. I need the closet space." Catherine didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't slap him. She simply adjusted her clutch, looked at Tiffany, who was smirking with the predatory glee of someone who thinks they've just won the lottery, and nodded. "As you wish, Preston," Catherine said. She turned around and walked down the stairs alone. Preston laughed, turning back to Tiffany. "I told you," he whispered. "She's weak. She has no fight in her. This divorce will be the easiest deal I've ever closed." He couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning the papers were served, but not in the privacy of their penthouse. Preston wanted to humiliate her. He had his lead counsel, Arthur Penhaligon, a man known in legal circles as the Butcher of Wall Street, serve Catherine while she was having lunch at Le Coucou with the board members of the city's largest library charity. Arthur slammed the thick envelope onto the white tablecloth, knocking over a crystal water glass. "Sign the receipt, Mrs. Sterling." Arthur sneered, adjusting his rimless glasses. "Preston wants you out of the Upper East Side property by Friday. He's feeling generous, so he's allowing you to keep the Hamptons cottage." For now." The table went silent. The charity board members, mostly old money women with pearls the size of golf balls, gasped. Catherine calmly picked up a napkin and dabbed the spilled water. She looked up at Arthur, her blue eyes icy and unblinking. "Tell my husband," she said, her voice steady, "that I will see him in court, and tell him to bring his checkbook. He's going to need it." Arthur laughed, a dry, barking sound. "Preston Sterling doesn't write checks to failures, Catherine. He crushes them." 3 weeks leading up to the trial, the media circus was relentless. The New York Post ran the headline, "Billionaire trades up the mistress versus the matron." Preston was living his best life. He had moved Tiffany into the penthouse immediately. The tabloids were full of photos of them shopping in Milan, partying in Ibiza, and touring the Sterling Hartwell headquarters as if they were royalty. Inside the headquarters, however, things were shifting. Preston sat in his office, the skyline of Manhattan sprawling behind him. Tiffany was sitting on the edge of his mahogany desk, scrolling through Instagram comments. "They love us, babe," Tiffany chirped. "Engagement is up 400%. We should launch a lifestyle brand once the divorce is finalized. Sterling and Company has a ring to it." "Anything you want," Preston said, distracted. He was looking at a financial report. "This is odd." "What?" "The dividend payouts for the shell companies," Preston muttered, frowning. "I'm trying to liquidate some assets to buy that island in the Caribbean for our honeymoon, but the accounts are locked." He buzzed his CFO, a nervous man named Gregson. "Gregson, why can't I access the Cayman accounts? I need 5 million liquid by noon." Gregson's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding terrified. "Sir, the authorization protocols have changed." "Changed by who? I'm the CEO," Preston roared. It's a legacy protocol, sir. From the merger in 2004. It requires a secondary signature for withdrawals over 1 million. "Whose signature?" The silent partner, sir." Preston rolled his eyes. "My father is dead, Gregson. Who else is there?" I'm not sure, sir. The legal team is looking into it. But Mr. Penhaligon says not to worry. It's likely just a clerical error from the old Beaumont merger. We can override it in court." "Beaumont," Preston scoffed. That was Catherine's maiden name. Her father had been a textile manufacturer, a small-time player compared to the Sterling Empire. When they married, Preston had absorbed her father's failing company into his own. He had done it as a favor, or so he told everyone. "Arthur says we're fine," Preston told Tiffany, dismissing the worry. "Just some old paperwork Catherine's dad probably screwed up decades ago. We'll crush her in court on Tuesday, strip her of her marital assets, and fix the bank accounts by Wednesday." Tiffany hopped off the desk and massaged his shoulders. "Don't let her stress you out. She's just a bitter housewife holding on to the past. You're the future." Meanwhile, across town, in a dusty, dimly lit office that smelled of old paper and peppermint tea, Catherine sat opposite her lawyer. She hadn't hired a shark like Arthur Penhaligon. She hadn't hired a TV lawyer. She had hired Eleanor Grantham. Eleanor was 72 years old. She wore orthopedic shoes and carried her files in a knitted tote bag. To the untrained eye, she looked like a grandmother who baked cookies. To those who knew the history of New York corporate law, Eleanor was the silent assassin. She hadn't been in a courtroom in 10 years, having retired to tend to her rose garden. But for Catherine, she had come back. "He's filed for a motion to dismiss your claim on the primary assets," Eleanor said, peering through thick bifocals. "He's offering you a settlement of $2 million and the 2018 Range Rover. He calls it generous." Catherine took a sip of her tea. "And the prenup? Ironclad," Eleanor said. "Or at least that's what Arthur thinks. It states that in the event of a divorce, you leave with what you brought into the marriage, and he keeps all assets generated by Sterling Hartwell Industries." "Perfect," Catherine said. A small, dangerous smile touched her lips for the first time in weeks. Eleanor chuckled a dry, raspy sound. "He really doesn't read the fine print, does he?" "Preston never reads," Catherine replied. "He just signs. He thinks power is about being the loudest person in the room. He forgot that power is actually about ownership." "We have everything we need," Eleanor said, closing the folder. "The red ledger is in the safe. The original incorporation documents from 1998 are certified." Catherine stood up. She looked tired, but her eyes were burning with a cold, intense fire. "He humiliated me, Eleanor. He brought that woman into my home. He paraded her in front of our friends. He thinks I'm nothing." "On Tuesday," Eleanor said, patting Catherine's hand, "he finds out you are everything." The morning of the trial, the steps of the Manhattan Superior Court looked less like a legal institution and more like the premiere of a summer blockbuster. Satellite trucks clogged Center Street, and a sea of reporters jostled for position behind police barricades. Preston Sterling arrived in a cavalcade of 3 black SUVs. He stepped out of the center vehicle wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit that cost more than the average American car. He waved to the crowd, flashing a blindingly white smile. Tiffany LeClaire was on his arm, dressed in a white pantsuit that was technically appropriate for court, but fitted so tightly it looked painted on. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried a neon pink Birkin bag, chewing gum with a rhythmic, nonchalant snap. "Mr. Sterling, is it true you're offering your wife 0 alimony?" a reporter from CNBC shouted. Preston paused, turning to the camera. "I don't reward mediocrity," he said, his voice projecting clearly. "In business, you get paid for value added. Catherine has added no value to my life for a decade. Why should she get a paycheck?" The crowd went wild. Tiffany giggled, whispering something in his ear that made him laugh. 10 minutes later, a yellow city cab pulled up to the side entrance. Catherine Sterling stepped out, followed by Eleanor Grantham. Catherine wore a simple, high-necked black dress and pearls. She looked like a grieving widow. There were no waves, no sound bites. She kept her head high, her eyes fixed on the heavy brass doors of justice. Inside courtroom 402, the atmosphere was stifling. The air conditioning was struggling against the body heat of the packed gallery. Everyone who was anyone in New York was there, rival CEOs, socialites, gossip columnists. The judge, Honorable Percival Harrington, banged his gavel. Judge Harrington was a man of the old school. He had been on the bench for 30 years and had 0 patience for theatrics. He peered over his spectacles at Tiffany, who was applying lip gloss in the front row behind the plaintiff's table. "Ms. LeClaire," Judge Harrington boomed. "This is a court of law, not a beauty salon. Put that away, or I will have the bailiff escort you out." Tiffany froze, flushing a deep crimson. Preston patted her hand, shooting a glare at the judge. "She's just nervous, Your Honor. Let's get on with this." "Watch your tone, Mr. Sterling," Harrington warned. "Mr. Penhaligon, your opening statement." Arthur Penhaligon stood up, smoothing his silk tie. He paced before the judge, exuding confidence. "Your Honor," Arthur began, his voice smooth as oil, "we are here today to correct a mistake. A marriage is a partnership, yes. But Sterling Hartwell Industries is not a marriage. It is a global superpower built by the sweat, blood, and genius of one man, Preston Sterling. Catherine Sterling was a passenger on this ship. She enjoyed the view, she ate the food, but she never visited the engine room. Now that the journey is over, she wants half the ship. It is absurd. It is unjust, and we will prove through the prenuptial agreement signed in 1998 that she is entitled to exactly what she contributed, nothing. Preston nodded vigorously from his seat. Then it was Eleanor Grantham's turn. She didn't pace. She didn't project. She stood behind her table, leaning slightly on her cane. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice raspy but clear. "We agree with Mr. Penhaligon on one thing. Sterling Hartwell Industries is indeed the result of a specific genius. We simply disagree on whose genius it was." A ripple of confused laughter went through the courtroom. Preston scoffed audibly. The morning session was a massacre, or so it seemed. Arthur Penhaligon called witness after witness to testify to Preston's business acumen. They brought out charts showing the company's growth. They brought out household staff who testified that Catherine spent most of her days gardening or reading. Then Preston took the stand. He sat in the witness box, legs crossed, looking every bit the master of the universe. "Mr. Sterling," Arthur asked, "describe the state of your finances when you married Catherine Beaumont in 1998. "I was already on the rise," Preston said, leaning into the microphone. "I had my first million. I had vision. I married Catherine because, well, she was safe. She was quiet. I needed a home base while I went out and conquered the world. And did she help you conquer it? God, no." Preston laughed. "She was afraid of risk. When I wanted to buy the lithium mines in Nevada, she cried, said it was too dangerous. I did it anyway. Made us $1 billion. If I had listened to her, we'd be living in a condo in Queens." "And the prenuptial agreement," Standard Troll Preston said. "What's mine is mine. What's hers is hers. Since she hasn't worked a day in 20 years, hers is 0. Thank you, Mr. Sterling." Arthur sat down, looking smug. Judge Harrington turned to the defense table. "Ms. Grantham, your witness?" Eleanor slowly rose to her feet. The room went silent. She shuffled toward the witness stand, holding a single yellowed piece of paper. Preston looked at her with pity. "Need a hand with that, Grandma?" He quitted. The gallery tittered. Judge Harrington frowned. "I am quite capable, Mr. Sterling," Eleanor said, smiling sweetly. "Now, let's talk about 2004. Preston blinked. He had expected her to ask about his affair or his spending habits. He had prepared speeches about how Tiffany was his muse. He wasn't expecting a date from 20 years ago. 2004, Preston asked. "What about it?" "That was a difficult year for you, wasn't it?" Eleanor asked. The dot-com bubble had burst a few years prior. Sterling Industries was leveraged to the hilt. You were to use a technical term, broke. Preston bristled. "I was experiencing a liquidity crunch. It's common." "You were 3 days away from bankruptcy," Eleanor corrected. "Your creditors were calling in loans. You needed capital and you needed it fast. But no bank would touch you. You were considered high risk." "I turned it around," Preston snapped. "Yes, you did," Eleanor said, "by acquiring Beaumont Textiles, your wife's father's company." "It was a mercy killing," Preston sneered. "Old man Beaumont was dying. His company was dusty. I absorbed it to save his legacy. I did Catherine a favor." "Did you?" Eleanor adjusted her glasses. "Interesting. Because according to the acquisition documents, you didn't buy Beaumont Textiles with cash. You didn't have any cash. It was a stock-for-stock merger," Preston said, waving his hand dismissively. "Standard practice." "Correct," Eleanor said. She placed the yellowed paper on the projector. It was a dense, legal document full of jargon. You issued shares of Sterling Industries to the Beaumont Trust in exchange for their assets. Those assets, specifically their real estate holdings in Manhattan, provided the collateral you needed to get new loans and save your own company. "So what?" Preston said. "I saved the company. The shares I gave them are worth billions now. Catherine should be thanking me." "We are getting to that," Eleanor said. "Now, Mr. Sterling, are you familiar with the concept of Class A versus Class B shares?" Preston rolled his eyes. "Of course. Class A has voting rights. Class B does not. I hold all the Class A shares. I control the board. I control the company. This is Business 101. And in the 2004 merger," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the silent room, "which shares did you issue to the Beaumont Trust?" "Class B," Preston said instantly. "Non-voting. I would never give away my voting power. Never." "Are you sure? I am the CEO. I wrote the deal terms myself," Preston shouted. "I gave them non-voting stock." "Mr. Penhaligon," Eleanor said, turning to the plaintiff's lawyer, "do you have the original 2004 merger agreement, the one signed by Mr. Sterling and Mr. Beaumont?" Arthur Penhaligon looked uncomfortable. He rifled through his papers. I have a digital copy here." "I have the original," Eleanor said. She pulled a heavy leather-bound folder from her tote bag. She opened it and handed it to the bailiff to give to the judge. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, "please look at page 42, clause 7, paragraph C." Judge Harrington put on his reading glasses. The room held its breath. The scratching of the judge's pen was the only sound. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, looking up, his eyebrows raised, "did you read this document before you signed it?" My lawyers drafted it," Preston stammered. "It says Class B. Actually," Eleanor interrupted, "it says Class B preferred. But if you read the footnote marked by that little asterisk you seem to have missed, it defines Class B preferred in the context of this specific agreement." Eleanor turned back to Preston. "Mr. Sterling, in the 2004 agreement, to secure the deal with Catherine's father, who was skeptical of your reckless nature, you agreed to a legacy clause. This clause states that the Class B preferred shares issued to the Beaumont Trust carry supervoting rights in the event of a moral breach by the CEO." Preston laughed nervously. "Moral breach? That's not a legal term, that's nonsense." "It is defined in the contract," Eleanor said, pointing to the screen where the text was now displayed. "A moral breach is defined as any public action that brings disrepute to the sanctity of the family unit, including but not limited to public infidelity, abandonment, or criminal negligence." The color drained from Preston's face. He looked at Arthur. Arthur was frantically reading the document, sweat beading on his forehead. "Arthur!" Preston hissed. "Is that true?" Arthur looked up, pale. I've never seen this addendum. It looks like it was added at the last minute by Beaumont's legal team." "And you signed it," Eleanor said to Preston. "You were so desperate for the money, so arrogant in your belief, that you would never be caught. Or perhaps you just didn't care enough to read it. You signed it." "So what?" Preston shouted, gripping the railing of the witness box. "So she has some voting rights. I still own 51% of the company. I can outvote her." Eleanor smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "Mr. Sterling, you own 51% of the common stock, but the supervoting shares issued to the Beaumont Trust carry a weight of 10 to 1 compared to common stock in the event of a moral breach. That was the condition your father-in-law insisted upon to ensure his daughter would never be discarded by a man who used her family's money to save himself." The courtroom erupted. Reporters were typing furiously. Tiffany dropped her phone. "Order!" Judge Harrington banged his gavel. "Order in the court." When the noise died down, Eleanor leaned in close to the microphone. Which brings us to the present, Mr. Sterling. By bringing your mistress to the Met Gala, by publicly humiliating your wife, and by admitting to the affair in court today, you have triggered the moral breach clause. Preston was shaking. This is a trick. I'm the majority shareholder. Not anymore, Eleanor said softly. As of this morning, when you confirmed your infidelity on public record, the voting weight of the Beaumont Trust shares shifted. Mathematically speaking, Catherine Sterling now controls 78% of the voting power of Sterling Hartwell Industries. That's impossible, Preston screamed, standing up. I am the company I am, Sterling Hartwell. No, Mr. Sterling, Eleanor said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. You are an employee, and I believe the majority shareholder has some questions about your recent performance. Preston looked at Catherine. For the first time all day, Catherine looked at him. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just stared at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist looking at a bug under a microscope. Your Honor, Arthur Penhaligon shouted, standing up. We request a recess. We need to review this document. Denied. Judge Harrington said, a small smile playing on his lips. You had 20 years to review the document, Mr. Penhaligon. Proceed, Mrs. Grantham. Thank you, Your Honor, Eleanor said. I have no further questions for this witness, but I would like to call our first witness to the stand. Who? Arthur demanded. The Chief Financial Officer of Sterling Hartwell, Eleanor said. Mr. Gregson, I believe he has some interesting information about where the company's money has actually been going for the last 6 months. Preston slumped back into his chair. He looked at Tiffany. She was no longer looking at him. She was looking at Catherine, and there was fear in her eyes. The air in courtroom 402 had shifted from a humid, sticky tension to a razor-sharp chill. Preston Sterling, once the titan of industry, was now sitting in the defendant's chair. His collar unbuttoned his face, a mask of sweating disbelief. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was staring at the leather-bound folder on the plaintiff's table, the folder that contained the document signing his life away. Call Mr. Gregson, the bailiff announced. Gary Gregson, the CFO of Sterling Hartwell, walked to the stand like a man marching to the gallows. He was a small man with a nervous tick in his left eye. He wiped his palms on his trousers before placing his hand on the Bible. Eleanor Grantham approached him gently, like a grandmother asking a child about a broken vase. Mr. Gregson, she began, her voice soft. You have been the CFO for 12 years, correct? Yes, ma'am, Gregson squeaked, and in that time you have managed the personal and professional accounts of Mr. Sterling. Yes, ma'am, though the lines are often blurred. Blurred, Eleanor repeated, tasting the word. Let's focus on the last 6 months, specifically the expenditures related to the consulting fees paid to Ms. Tiffany Leclerc. Tiffany stiffened in the front row. Preston shot Gregson a warning look, his eyes narrowing. Objection, Arthur Penhaligon shouted, standing up. Relevance Ms. Leclerc's employment is a private company matter. It becomes a public matter, Eleanor countered, when company funds are used to facilitate the moral breach we discussed earlier. If Mr. Sterling used shareholder money to fund his affair that constitutes embezzlement and fraud, which nullifies his executive immunity. Judge Harrington nodded. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Gregson. Gregson took a shaky breath. Mr. Sterling instructed me to categorize expenses for Mrs. Leclerc under marketing and outreach. And what did these expenses entail? Eleanor asked. Gregson pulled out a spreadsheet. $450,000 for brand research in Milan, which was a shopping trip. $1.2 million for logistical housing, which was the purchase of a condo in Soho. And $250,000 for asset acquisition. And what was the asset? Gregson looked down at his shoes. A 12-carat yellow diamond necklace. The courtroom gasped. Eleanor turned to the gallery, her eyes landing squarely on Tiffany's neck. The massive yellow diamond glittered under the harsh fluorescent lights. Tiffany instinctively covered it with her hand, her face flushing a deep, guilty red. "So," Eleanor said, turning back to Preston, "you didn't just cheat on your wife, Mr. Sterling. You stole from your company a company that, as we established 10 minutes ago, is now controlled by your wife to pay for it." "I am the CEO!" Preston roared, unable to contain himself. "I have discretionary spending power. I can buy whatever I want. Not without board approval for personal gifts over $10,000. Gregson whispered into the microphone. "It's in the bylaws, sir. I tried to tell you." "You're fired, Gregson!" Preston screamed. "You can't fire him." Catherine spoke up. It was the first time Catherine had spoken since the trial began. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the room instantly. She didn't stand up. She remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, looking at Preston with a calm, terrifying authority. According to the supervoting rights of the Class B preferred shares, Catherine continued reciting the bylaws from memory. Executive termination requires a majority vote. "You have 22% of the vote, Preston. I have 78%. Mr. Gregson stays." Preston looked at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. He was no longer the bully in the playground. He was the child who realized he had lost his mother's hand in a crowd. Eleanor smiled and turned back to Gregson. "One last question. The Cayman Island accounts that Mr. Sterling tried to access 3 weeks ago. Why were they locked?" Gregson looked at Catherine, then back at Eleanor. "Because those accounts were never Mr. Sterling's." "Explain," Judge Harrington commanded. "When the merger happened in 2004, Gregson explained, the capital injection from the Beaumont Trust was placed into a protected escrow account. It was designed to be the company's rainy day fund. The silent partner signature required to access it is Catherine Sterling's." Preston felt the blood leave his head. "What? You've been trying to withdraw my money, Preston," Catherine said coolly. "For 20 years you thought you were building an empire on your own genius. But every time you over-leveraged, every time you made a reckless bet, and miraculously found the liquidity to cover it. That was me. I signed the approvals. I kept you afloat. I let you play the big man because I loved you. I thought you just needed to feel important." She stood up slowly, smoothing her skirt. "But you didn't just want to feel important. You wanted to make me feel small. You used my father's money to build your name, and then you tried to use it to buy a new life with her." She gestured to Tiffany. "And that, Preston, is where you made a fatal accounting error." Arthur Penhaligon slumped in his chair. He knew it was over. There was no legal maneuvering that could save a client who had unknowingly signed away his voting rights and then publicly violated the terms of the contract while embezzling funds from the majority shareholder. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, "the defense rests." The recess while Judge Harrington deliberated was the longest hour of Preston Sterling's life. He sat in a private holding room with Arthur and Tiffany. "Fix this, Arthur." Preston paced the small room, sweating through his $5,000 suit. "Find a loophole. Get the judge to declare the 2004 agreement invalid. Say I was under duress." "You weren't under duress." "Preston," Arthur said, rubbing his temples. "You were arrogant. You signed a deal you didn't read because you thought Catherine's father was a fool. It turns out he was playing 4D chess while you were playing checkers. I still have the prenup. Preston insisted. "The prenup says, what's mine is mine." "The prenup applies to marital assets," Arthur snapped. "But the company isn't a marital asset anymore. It's a hostile entity controlled by your wife. If she votes to fire you, you lose your salary. If she votes to dilute your shares, your stock becomes worthless. She doesn't need to divorce you to ruin you, Preston. She just needs to call a board meeting." Tiffany was sitting in the corner, furiously texting. "Who are you talking to?" Preston barked at her. "My agent," Tiffany said, not looking up. "I need to issue a statement. A statement about our love, about how we'll get through this." Tiffany looked up. Her eyes were cold, devoid of the adoration that had been there that morning. "Preston, you're broke. You're about to be investigated for embezzlement. And you're technically not even the CEO anymore. I'm a brand. I can't be associated with a sinking ship." "I bought you a condo," Preston screamed. "I bought you that necklace." Tiffany touched the diamonds at her throat. "Technically," she said, a cruel smirk playing on her lips, "the company bought this. And since Catherine owns the company, I guess I should return it to her. But not you." She stood up, grabbed her Birkin bag and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" "To the ladies' room," she lied. "And then, I think I'm going to call an Uber." She walked out. Preston Sterling was alone with his lawyer, staring at a blank wall, listening to the muffled sound of his life collapsing. When the court reconvened, the gallery was standing room only. Word had spread on social media. #SterlingTakedown was trending #1 globally. Judge Harrington swept into the room, his robes billowing. He sat down and adjusted his glasses. "I have reviewed the evidence," Harrington began, his voice booming. "The court finds the 2004 merger agreement to be valid and binding. The moral breach clause was clear defined and blatantly violated by the defendant, Mr. Sterling." He looked at Preston. "Mr. Sterling, you came into this court asking to enforce a prenuptial agreement to deny your wife equitable distribution. You claimed she contributed nothing to your empire. The evidence suggests the opposite, that without her family's capital and her silent oversight, there would be no empire. Therefore," Harrington continued, "the court rules as follows. 1. The voting rights of the Class B preferred shares are immediately activated, granting Catherine Sterling 78% voting control of Sterling Hartwell Industries. 2. The prenuptial agreement is upheld, but with a caveat. Since Mr. Sterling commingled personal and company funds to facilitate his affair, a forensic audit is ordered. Any assets purchased with company funds, including the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and the gifts to Ms. Leclerc, are hereby frozen and returned to the company's asset pool." Preston gripped the table. "You're taking my house." "It's not your house, Mr. Sterling," the judge said. "It's the company's corporate housing, and since you are likely to be removed from your position, you are hereby ordered to vacate the premises within 48 hours. "This is insane," Preston shouted. "Furthermore," the judge said, ignoring the outburst, "regarding the request for alimony, since Mrs. Sterling is now effectively the employer of Mr. Sterling and controls the majority of the assets, she has waived her right to alimony. However, she has filed a counter-motion for legal fees and emotional damages due to the public defamation of character." Judge Harrington looked at Catherine. "Mrs. Sterling, do you wish to speak?" Catherine stood up. She walked to the center of the room. She didn't look at the judge. She looked at Preston. "I don't want your money." "Preston," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I have plenty of my own now. I don't want an apology. It wouldn't be sincere." She took a step closer to him. The camera zoomed in. "I just want one thing. I want you to admit it. Just once. Admit that you didn't do it alone." Preston looked around the courtroom. He saw the reporters hungry for his humiliation. He saw his empty chair where Tiffany used to sit. He saw Arthur Penhaligon packing up his briefcase, already mentally moving on to the next client. Preston's ego was a fortress, but the walls had been breached. He looked at Catherine, the woman he had called boring simple weak. "I," Preston croaked. His throat was dry. "I built this." "No," Catherine said softly. "We built this, and I am taking it back." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, as the majority shareholder, I would like to make a formal announcement for the record. Effective immediately, Preston Sterling is relieved of his duties as CEO of Sterling Hartwell Industries for cause. He is barred from entering company premises. His security clearance is revoked." She turned back to Preston, her eyes hard as diamonds. "You're fired, Preston." The gavel banged. "Court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters leaped over the benches. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. Catherine didn't stay to answer questions. She turned and walked down the center aisle, flanked by Eleanor. As she passed the front row, she saw Tiffany trying to sneak out the side exit. "Ms. Leclerc!" Catherine called out. Tiffany froze. The cameras swung to her. Catherine pointed to the necklace. "That belongs to the shareholders. Please leave it with the bailiff on your way out, or I'll have you charged with possession of stolen property." Tiffany's hands shook as she unclasped the necklace. She dropped it into the bailiff's hand and ran out the door, shielding her face with her purse. Catherine walked out the heavy brass doors into the bright afternoon sun. The roar of the crowd outside was deafening, but for the first time in 20 years, Catherine didn't walk 2 steps behind anyone. She walked alone into the waiting car, the undisputed queen of the city. The heavy brass doors of the Manhattan Superior Court slammed shut, but the sound didn't echo for Preston Sterling. It felt final, like the lid of a coffin clicking into place. He stood on the bottom step of the courthouse, the wind whipping his charcoal suit jacket against his side. The media frenzy had followed Catherine's motorcade as it sped away, leaving Preston standing in the debris of his own life with nothing but his briefcase and a terrifying silence. He reached into his pocket for his phone to call his driver, Henry. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service," the automated voice droned. Preston stared at the screen. Of course, the corporate phone plan. Catherine hadn't waited 24 hours. She hadn't even waited 24 minutes. He was cut off. "Fine," Preston muttered, his jaw tight. "I'll take a cab." He hailed a yellow taxi sliding into the cracked leather seat. "The Plaza Hotel," he barked. If he couldn't go home to the penthouse, he would stay in the royal suite until his lawyers fixed this mess. He was Preston Sterling. He had connections. He had credit. At the Plaza's reception desk, the concierge, a man Preston had tipped thousands of dollars to over the years, looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite pity, but certainly wasn't respect. "Mr. Sterling?" The concierge said, his voice lowered. Unfortunately, we cannot process your reservation at this time." "What do you mean?" Preston slammed his black card onto the marble counter. "Run it again. It's an Amex Centurion. It has no limit." "It has been declined, sir. Code 402, stolen or lost asset. The card issuer has been instructed to confiscate it upon use." Preston felt the blood drain from his face. "Confiscate it." "I'm afraid so, sir." The concierge gently slid the black titanium card behind the counter. "Is there another form of payment?" "The room rate is $4,500 a night." Preston reached for his wallet. He had his personal Visa, his debit card. He tried them all. Declined. Frozen. Restricted. He stood in the lobby of the hotel where he had hosted his 40th birthday party, penniless. He looked around. People were watching. A woman in the lobby bar whispered to her husband, pointing. They weren't looking at him with awe anymore. They were looking at him like a car crash. I'll make a call, Preston stammered, backing away. There's been a banking error. He walked out into the street. It had started to rain a cold grey drizzle that soaked through his Italian wool suit. He realized with a jolt of true terror that he didn't even have cash for a subway ticket. He had stopped carrying cash years ago. Cash was for poor people. He began to walk. 40 blocks north, the atmosphere inside the Sterling Hartwell boardroom was electric. The 30-member board sat around the long oval table, shifting uncomfortably in their Herman Miller chairs. They were used to Preston's shouting, his pacing, his manic energy. Today the room was silent. At the head of the table sat Catherine Sterling. She hadn't changed out of her court clothes. She sat with perfect posture, her hands clasped on top of the red ledger, the book of accounts that had won the war. Eleanor Grantham sat to her right, sipping tea from a thermos. "Gentlemen," Catherine said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a timbre of steel that commanded absolute attention. "And ladies, thank you for convening on such short notice." "Mrs. Sterling," interrupted George Hammerstein, a board member who had been one of Preston's closest allies. "With all due respect, this is highly irregular. The stock is down 12% in after-hours trading. The market hates uncertainty. We need to issue a statement reinstating Preston as a consultant at the very least. He is the face of the company." Catherine turned her head slowly to look at George. "The market hates volatility, George, and Preston was the definition of volatile. The stock is down because you are all panicking. It will be up by tomorrow morning when they realize that the adults are finally in charge." She opened the red ledger. "For 20 years, Catherine continued, Preston ran this company on gut instinct and leverage. He bought companies he didn't understand and sold assets he didn't value. And every time he missed a margin call, every time he needed a bailout, he came to me. This book contains the record of 17 separate occasions where the Beaumont Trust injected capital to save this company from bankruptcy. 17 times George." She slid the book down the table. George opened it. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages. "I didn't know," he whispered. We thought he was a magician." "He wasn't a magician," Catherine said. "He was a gambler playing with house money. My house's money." She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. "Things are going to change. We are selling the private jet fleet. We are liquidating the holdings in the crypto mining sector. It's volatile and bad for the environment. We are reinvesting those funds into the logistics division, specifically the AI infrastructure Preston ignored because it wasn't sexy enough." But Catherine, another board member, asked, "You've never run a company before. How do we know you can handle the day-to-day?" Catherine turned back to them, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Who do you think reviewed the quarterly reports before Preston signed them? Who do you think spotted the regulatory issues in the merger with Omnicorp last year? Preston didn't read those briefs. I did. I have been running this company from my dining room table for a decade while he was out playing golf and chasing skirts. I don't need to learn how to do the job. I've already been doing it. I'm just finally taking the credit." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. "Now, is there anyone here who feels they cannot work under my leadership? If so, the door is open. Your severance packages will be fair. But if you stay, you check your ego at the door, and you work for the shareholders, not for the glory." Silence. Not a single person moved. "Good," Catherine said. "Meeting adjourned. Get to work." 3 months later. The winter had been harsh in New York. Preston Sterling was living in a studio apartment in Queens. It was a walk-up fourth floor above a laundromat that rumbled day and night. He had tried to get hired. He had called his competitors. He had called the firms he used to bully. But the word was out. Preston Sterling wasn't just toxic. He was a liability. And more importantly, everyone was terrified of Catherine. She had ruthlessly dismantled Preston's old network, exposing the corruption and the backroom deals. No one wanted to hire the man who had brought down the wrath of the Iron Lady of Wall Street, as the papers now called her. Preston sat on his futon eating noodles from a styrofoam cup. The TV was on. CNBC was airing a special report. The chyron read, "Sterling Hartwell stock hits all-time high." Joining us now, the anchor announced, is the CEO of the year, Catherine Sterling. Preston stopped eating. He leaned forward. Catherine looked radiant. She wasn't wearing the severe black she had worn in court. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer, her hair loose and soft. She looked younger, lighter. "Catherine," the interviewer asked, "turnaround stories are rare in this business, but you've not only stabilized the company, you've doubled its profits. What's your secret?" Catherine smiled. "I think, for a long time, the company was focused on projection, on looking big. We shifted the focus to foundation, to being strong. It turns out when you stop trying to impress people and start trying to serve them, the business takes care of itself. And your ex-husband," the interviewer prodded, "do you have any contact?" Preston held his breath. Catherine's expression didn't change. It wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was indifferent. "I wish him well," she said simply. "I hope he finds what he's looking for. But frankly, I don't have time to look back. We have a lot of work to do." The interview cut to a commercial. Preston turned off the TV. He looked around his small, dingy apartment. He looked at his hands that used to sign billion-dollar deals, now shaking slightly. He realized then that the punishment wasn't the poverty. It wasn't the loss of the jet or the suits. The punishment was the irrelevance. He had spent his whole life terrified of being nobody. And Catherine, in her quiet, methodical way, had granted his greatest fear. He was just a man in a room, and she was the world. 6 months later, the annual shareholders' meeting was held at the Jacob Javits Center. Thousands of people attended. The mood was celebratory. Catherine stood backstage adjusting her microphone. Eleanor Grantham, now the official chief legal officer, stood beside her. "You nervous?" Eleanor asked. "No," Catherine said. "I'm ready." "There's someone who wants to see you," Eleanor said. "Security stopped him at the VIP entrance, but I thought you might want to know." Catherine paused. "Him? Yes. He says he just wants to talk. He says he has a business proposition." Catherine laughed, a genuine hearty sound. "A proposition. Even now. He says he has an idea for a startup. He wants you to be an angel investor." Catherine shook her head, amazement in her eyes. The audacity of the man was almost impressive in a pathological way. He still didn't get it. He still thought this was a game where you could just buy back in. "Tell security to give him a validation voucher for parking if he drove," Catherine said. "But tell him I'm not investing. I only invest in assets with long-term value. And if he insists, tell him." Catherine said, walking toward the stage curtains, hearing the roar of the crowd chanting her name, that the Bank of Catherine is closed, permanently. She stepped out into the spotlight. The applause was deafening, a wave of sound that washed over her. She didn't shrink from it. She didn't hide in anyone's shadow. She stepped up to the podium, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Preston Sterling, watching from a cracked phone screen on a park bench outside the center, saw her take command. He saw the way the audience hung on her every word. He saw the respect he had chased his whole life, but never actually earned. He turned off the phone. The screen went black, reflecting his own tired, aged face. He put the phone in his pocket, stood up, and walked into the anonymous crowd of the city, disappearing into the noise, just another face in the empire his wife had built. The story of Preston and Catherine Sterling serves as a brutal reminder that true power is not loud. It does not need to shout, it does not need to strut, and it certainly does not need to humiliate others to validate itself. Preston mistook silence for weakness, and patience for submission. He built a house of cards on a foundation of arrogance, forgetting that the person holding the foundation together had the power to pull it all down. In the end, Catherine didn't just win a court case, she reclaimed her identity. She proved that dignity is a long game, and while the tortoise may not make the headlines in the first lap, it always inevitably owns the finish line. It is a lesson for every partner, every business owner, and every person. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They are the ones watching, learning, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Wow, I don't know about you, but watching Preston realize his credit card was declined was possibly the most satisfying moment of the year. It just goes to show, be careful who you step on your way up, because they might be the ones holding the ladder. What do you think? Did Preston deserve a harsher punishment, or was becoming irrelevant? The ultimate revenge. And what would you have done if you were Catherine? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of massive revenge and justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. We have a crazy one coming up next week about a lottery winner who hid his ticket from his family for 10 years. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching and stay safe out there.